Good afternoon and welcome today to the clinical trials webinar that we are putting on here with ALS Canada. I'm Tammy Moore and I'm the CEO of the ALS Society of Canada, and I'd like to welcome you to our session this afternoon. Today is actually Global ALS M&D Awareness Day, an important day in our calendars as we acknowledge the contribution that is being made around the world by organizations, clinicians, researchers, industry, and people affected by ALS. Together, united in a world to create a world free of ALS M&D. ALS Society of Canada has an important role in this effort as a convener, facilitator, contributor, and supporter. On a global level, ALS Canada is a significant contributor to the International Alliance of ALS M&D Associations, over 50 member organizations that are collectively working to share resources, to support people actively living with ALS, to coordinate information on research and therapeutic developments, and to address needs in underserved countries as we coordinate pathways to therapeutic treatments. In Canada, the National Research Program is a unique aspect of ALS Canada's mission. We are making critical investments in cutting-edge research and building research and clinical capacity across the country. On a pan-Canadian level, we are advocating for access to therapies, working with industry, the federal and provincial governments, the healthcare system and payers to ensure all Canadians have equitable and timely access, and making sure decision makers are well informed by the people who are affected by ALS. Within Ontario, ALS Canada has a similar role to the provincial societies, helping people within the province to navigate their journey with ALS. We are providing direct community services one-to-one right in people's homes, connecting them and providing virtual support groups, connection to community resources, and providing the necessary mobility and home care equipment that people will need as their disease progresses. It is important to note the work we do at ALS Canada and contribution that we can make in all aspects of ALS is completely funded by the generosity of donors. We are grateful for their support and dedication to the cause, to ALS and to the ALS Society of Canada. With your help, we can create a future without ALS. As well as Global ALS M&D Awareness Day, today is also National Indigenous Peoples Day here in Canada, and I would like to share a land acknowledgement and a few words on our commitment. At the ALS Society of Canada, we are continuing our learning and the work of addressing inclusion, diversity, equity, and accessibility, or as we have named it, IDEA. We are taking the opportunity to understand and consider how these issues and opportunities for change reflect in our culture for our staff and volunteers, in the work we do to support the ALS community we serve, in the research we invest in, and in our collaboration within the healthcare system and with partners in industry, and how, as an organization, we can demonstrate leadership to address systemic issues. Together, as we come together today for this national webinar, I am speaking to you from the traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, Haudenosaunee, and Wendat peoples. We also acknowledge that this territory is covered by Treaty 13. In this spirit of reconciliation, we honor and acknowledge the enduring presence of Inuit, Métis, and First Nations peoples. We are grateful to have the opportunity to come together on this land, and we invite you to understand what lands that you are speaking from today. Thank you for being a part of today's event. I would now like to introduce you to the person who needs no introduction, Dr. David Taylor, Vice President of Research and Strategic Relationships at ALS Canada.
Hello, everyone. All right, I'm not sure if we can all see my screen, but I'm going to go with it. I believe we can. So Thank you for the welcome, Tammy. And my name is David Taylor. I'm the VP of Research for ALS Canada. Today, we're going to talk about something a little different from what we've done on Global Awareness Days in the past. We have talked about clinical trials often, and it's been sort of a list of what clinical trials are happening in Canada or around the world. My apologies. I'm just going to get rid of something off my screen here so I can see all my slides. But today we're going to do something a little bit different. It's actually going to be a little bit more storytelling on a particular story that we've never really actually told before, which helps to highlight the clinical trial excellency here in Canada and how you can help us to maintain and even build on that. So let's see if, let me click. Okay, so we're going to do a little expectation setting here first, and that's based on what I just sort of said. Today is not a webinar about the various trials happening in Canada right now. And based on some of the questions we got, it was felt that that was perhaps something many people thought. What I can tell you is that, at the end of it, we will have a nice discussion with two really special guests, but we will make sure we get back to your questions that you did send, or any ones you send today. We will get back to you on those because we want to make sure that you are getting all the information you need. And certainly, please fear not, there are a lot of sources for that information, and our ALS Canada research team can support on those. You are not alone if you're confused or struggling to understand the clinical trial landscape, the clinical treatment landscape, and you can email us at research@als.ca. We are not able to provide medical advice. We certainly are connected into the clinicians in Canada, which you'll see, but we are able to provide information on basically anything that is going on in the clinical space around or clinical trial space around the world. So please don't hesitate to reach out. Today's specific goal is really to rally around the ALS community for a collaborative ongoing strategy to make Canada a primary destination for the top experimental improvement treatments. And we do need your support, and we'll talk at the end about what that means for you to acknowledge that support. So ALS clinical trials, what's the beginning? Well, if we go back to the very beginning, 1874, many people will know, it was a series of lectures where Dr. Jean-Martin Charcot, after quite a number of years of trying to understand what ALS was, really formalized it. Amyotrophic lateral sclerosis had some amazing illustrations and description that still holds up today for what ALS is. But for many years, there was not a lot known outside of neurologists around what ALS was, and the wider public didn't really know what this disease was. And so this is even in the early 1900s, it was still a big deal to even have a case study on an individual who had ALS. So you can imagine that clinical trials were still a far off type thing. However, clinicians did try various things to be able to see if there's something they could do to intervene with their patients. Now, obviously in 1939, it got much wider attention when Lou Gehrig from the New York Yankees, the Hall of Fame baseball player, was diagnosed. And actually his physician had wanted to try vitamin E because they had shown that in mice who had a vitamin E deficiency, they got a paralysis, and there was an attempt to try vitamin E as a potential treatment for ALS, including with Lou Gehrig. And in fact, this is sort of one of the early stages of showing that competition has always been a big thing in science, where it didn't want to let the other doctor publish first. And when that other physician published, pretty much across the board, what they showed was that vitamin E did not have a significant effect on ALS. However, they didn't do this in what we would call a balanced, sort of scientifically organized clinical trial. And that's because this was in the early 1940s, and it's widely acknowledged that it wasn't until 1946 that you really had this first idea of a real balanced study in a clinical trial type format. And this was a famous study in the UK where they actually took groups of people who had tuberculosis. They separated them into two different wards, didn't tell them, which is something you can't get away with today, that they were part of a study, and gave one group of individuals streptomycin along with the normal clinical treatment they would give, and the other group they gave no streptomycin plus that same treatment. And then they didn't tell the physicians that were monitoring them whether they had streptomycin or not. And it turned out that there was a lot learned from this. The streptomycin did work in the short term. We learned about antibiotic resistance from this, but really it allowed to separate in a way that would be more akin to a placebo-controlled trial that we would have in current day. So one of the things that, in Canada, we typically have a little bit of a have-not envy when we're so close to the United States. The United States has so many different things that we don't have. And it's really, from a very young age, if you're a Canadian, this can be something that creeps into our mentality. For myself, I grew up in southwestern Ontario, so I had a lot of Detroit and Cleveland TV stations, and I saw all these cool things as a child that I really wanted and couldn't get in Canada. And so it comes to the idea that, you know, we always sort of believe that the United States has things that we don't. And I don't mean to trivialize this, because there are things, in fact, that a person living with ALS would see that the United States has that Canada doesn't, and feel like, you know, this is something that we don't have. And I've now taken the quotations off the top there. You can see it's not have not envy, but it's actually have not envy, because what we're going to learn today is that Canada really is a world leader unto itself in terms of clinical trial space of ALS. So something like the Healy platform trial, we don't have in Canada. In fact, the clinicians here decided that it was probably in the best interests of the Canadian sites to be able to move forward and have a lot of great opportunities by not being a part of that trial, which is a really good complementary effort to what's happening in the US. But when things like that, or perhaps Brainstorm or other trials that you see and you think, well, we don't have that here in Canada, there's a belief that, you know, you would want to go try those things. But it's important to also know that clinical trials are experiments, and in the end, we do not know whether or not any of these therapies work. And so even if something is potentially built up to be a bigger deal because there's more exposure to it, it doesn't necessarily mean that we know whether it will have any effect on ALS better than the things that we have here in Canada. And it's important to always remember that the scientific consensus at the end of the day is what really rules over whether something is likely effective or not in ALS. That said, I don't want to say the Healy trial is a fantastic evolution in trying to move things forward without building new clinical trials and then tearing them down. You can have a continuous set of therapies that are tested. But again, what we'll see today is that Canada really is an opportunity, has a lot of opportunities for ALS clinical research. In terms of early ALS clinical trials, in fact, it wasn't until about the 1970s that you started to see these kind of creep in a more formalized fashion. And that also coincides with the birth of sort of dedicated ALS researchers. And in fact, those first clinical trials came from a lot of anecdotal reports of people who have been trying different things and said that they were benefiting from it or stabilizing in their disease. And one of the first ones was a clinic in Florida, and I happen to have some of these old newspaper clippings from here in Canada of a snake venom treatment. And in fact, once they did a clinical trial of this, it was shown that the snake venom was not effective. In fact, those who were on the snake venom did worse than on the placebo. And actually, our founder here is quoted in this, it's quite good, talking about the study indicated that temporary improvements are part of the natural course of disease. That's actually very relevant today for any situation where someone may have an experience with a clinical trial, but isn't necessarily the results of a balanced long-term study. And also, you know, here talking about a double-blind study that places the modified snake neurotoxin treatment in perspective as a non-beneficial treatment. Again, here you can see that another newspaper clipping talking about Dr. Hudson had to convince my mom not to go to Florida for hours, that he was very upset about money wasted on treatment for a few individuals where it was not actually showing that it had any proof. So these are actually still relevant today. And still some people didn't believe even after the clinical trial and had faith that this worked. But there were a number of, or actually 2 papers that came out that were peer-reviewed papers that actually showed that these clinical trials didn't end up working for ALS. And so a number of other things that were sort of in the same situation where people tried them and they felt they experienced something better, got into more balanced clinical trials. Guanidine, something called isoprinosine, and transfer factor were all ones that were tested because they were sort of brought to the clinicians in ALS that said, you should really test these because we believe that there may be something there. And guanidine was actually tested by a gentleman who was probably widely known as one of the first dedicated ALS researchers, Dr. Forbes Norris in San Francisco, who's also well known to have started the first idea of multidisciplinary care in ALS. So prior to that, ALS care was largely just involving a neurologist. And his idea of this was to include a wider array of individuals, as many of you will know if you've been to an ALS clinic, who can support different aspects of the symptoms in the disease. And I mentioned this because, in fact, in Canada, this is one of the things that really spurred us to be an early adopter in terms of clinical trials as well. And our co-founder Dr. Arthur Hudson is widely also known as probably having the second multidisciplinary care clinic anywhere in the world in London, Ontario. And in fact, this is evidenced by our early minutes from ALS Canada, where you can see in 1977, which is our first year, he talked about building a network of clinicians and actually getting them involved in what he called his GRASP team. And his GRASP team was his multidisciplinary care team, and saying that this was a better way to be able to do ALS care. And it is those sort of multidisciplinary care idea that can ultimately bridge to the idea of clinical trials, because with outcome measures in clinical trials, you have respiratory outcome measures, you have all kinds of different tests that can benefit from a much better and wider care team around somebody who's living with the disease and participating in a trial. And some of the great evidence of Dr. Hudson's early adoption of this was in newspaper clippings. Here you can see a speech language pathologist, an occupational therapist, and really this preceded it being widely adopted by over a decade across the world in terms of multidisciplinary care. And there are still countries that are seeking their first sort of multidisciplinary care ALS focused clinic. And he was so much of an adopter of this that in fact he even had news articles where he wasn't even a part of the discussion because he believed so much in this idea of an equal care continuum across his team. So I bring this up again because this then actually helped to bring clinical trials to Canada. And one of his colleagues, Dr. Andrew Eisen, when he was in Montreal, left Montreal and went to the University of British Columbia. And Dr. Eisen was really widely known in Canada as one of the first early adopters of clinical research. And here from the early 1980s, after establishing his multidisciplinary care clinic in Vancouver, he's talking about the idea of starting to get clinical trials going. And so in fact, you can see here in 1993, this is, we believe, probably the first published Canadian ALS clinical trial of lamotrigine. This is actually targeting something called hyperexcitability, which is actually today still considered a relevant target for ALS, and there are a number of trials active and coming soon, which might be testing this hypothesis. So it was a really great idea to do. It ultimately didn't show benefit in ALS, but it really sort of spurned on this initial idea of clinical trials in Canada quite early on. Now, this may seem like a very long time ago, but in fact, if we take this sort of to a pop culture idea, it's not that long ago in the end. This was around the time that Jurassic Park was in theaters. That is some time ago, but again, it shows you when people talk about 150 years since we discovered ALS, really modern ALS research is a much shorter time frame that we've made the huge advancements that we've had. So this really started the beginnings of a Canadian clinical trial network, or at least neurologist network that could work on clinical trials. And if you get into the mid 1990s, you can see here that it says that over the time since the 1970s, one of the big changes was that therapeutic trials now emanate from the science, not necessarily from an individual author's theory or something brought to them by their patients saying that they experienced a benefit from a particular treatment. And again, here you can say in the past 5 years, this is again from the mid 90s, saying that the revolution in the design and execution of clinical trials in ALS were large multi-center placebo-controlled trials becoming the norm. So that was sort of the evolution. And Canada was part of that evolution. And in fact, as a lot of the US clinical trials started to happen, such as growth factors, which there's two examples here, others besides Dr. Eisen that were involved were Dr. Michael Strong in London, Ontario, at University of Western Ontario, Dr. Neil Cashman, who started at McGill, moved to Sunnybrook in Toronto, and eventually to Vancouver, and Dr. Michael Brook at University of Alberta were all involved in some of these early growth factor trials here in Canada. And as time went on, over the next several years, you ended up having a bigger network built out with Dr. John Turnbull at McMaster University, Dr. Angela Genge at McGill after Dr. Cashman left, and Dr. Jean-Pierre Bouchard in Quebec City. And we'll hear from Dr. Johnston a little bit later today. She actually came from Oregon in the United States as part of a clinical trials network there and moved to Edmonton, where she also became a huge part of the evolution of clinical trials here in Canada. And others in Saskatchewan, like Dr. Vanina Dalbello-Haas and Dr. Walter Hayter, were involved in trials as well. And we can see here from a clipping of a newsletter from ALS Canada in the mid-90s, Canada was actually involved in some of the growth factor trials, as well as follow-up to the Riluzole initial trials to be able to verify the efficacy and the real-world effectiveness of that. So collaborative ALS trial networks sort of started in these mid-90s, and it really, one of the big ones that still remains probably the biggest one in the world today is NEALS. This starting in 1995. There's a great story behind that as well that I won't allude to now. The Western ALS Study Group, this is one that Dr. Johnston was part of. On the west coast of the United States, continue to be a lot of the investigators here continue to be big players in the clinical trial field in ALS. In Europe, there was was NCALS, which eventually became TriCALS as a clinical trial network across Europe, as well as PACTALS in the Asia Pacific region. And in 2008, that is when this network kind of got formalized in Canada into CALS, of the Canadian ALS Research Network. So in 2008, when CALS was established, what was sort of the state of clinical trials? Well, there were a lot more that had happened over the years. We won't get into the details of these, and there were a lot more that were sort of starting to come to fruition and in the pipeline to start fairly soon. And this was because we were starting to evolve our understanding of the science of ALS. However, and this is something I'd be happy to talk about another time, is that I really believe 2006 was the birth of sort of modern day ALS research. So we still had a long way to go, but it showed you that these networks had really advanced things in terms of running clinical trials. And as you can see here in around 2008, there had been 32 unique compounds that have been tested in phase 2 or phase 3 clinical trials. Now, just to tell you, this is about less than 15 years later, we've got 70 plus active clinical trials globally happening in ALS, and many more companies that are currently doing clinical development. So it shows you how far things have come in a short period of time. Certainly in an ALS timeline, 15 years is way too long, and we do understand that, but from a scientific timeline, this is a very fast evolution and development. So CALS was sort of born as a formalized network in 2008. Really, part of the work, a large part of the work was done by my predecessor at ALS Canada, Dr. Denise Figowitz, along with Dr. Lauren Zimman at Sunnybrook in Toronto. And as you can see here, there are many clinics across Canada who are a part of the CALS network. And some of these sites or some of these cities actually have multiple CALS clinics within them. Now, one of the first questions that I think many people would come up with in current day is, that's great that there are many CALS clinics, but not all of these sites across Canada will have an equitable access to clinical trials. And so it should be noted that the CALS network is actively working to try to mentor different sites and to try to evolve those sites and do what they can to support them in bringing clinical trials there. Many people are aware that in Vancouver, there's work done by the ALS Society of BC with Project Hope to try to bring someone there that can help bring back clinical trials. I told you earlier that clinical trials started in Canada, really with Dr. Eisen in Vancouver. So bringing them back there is a priority for sure. Winnipeg, we've heard good things that there may be a potential person coming there that could be mentored and helped into bringing trials back to Manitoba. Halifax, again, has had clinical trials in the past, and certainly we're all very aware of that and trying to figure out ways to make that happen. And other places like Charlottetown and St. John's have probably not the capacity to be running clinical trials in the near future, but they do have leaders there who are actively attuned to what's happening in the CALS network. A great example of that is Dr. Heather Williams in PEI, who has actually managed to be able to get 2 individuals on the island into an expanded access program through connections and understanding what's happening, despite not actually having a clinic that would run clinical trials in Charlottetown. So really, this network idea is a great way to be able to make equitable access and good access to experimental therapeutics across the country. And one of the ways that we can help to bolster this is a sort of a collaboration between ALS Canada and CALS over the years, which is the Clinical Research Fellowship. And this is actually a way to take a young neurologist who, we want to be able to push into becoming a specialist in ALS care and research. And sort of the prototype of this was the very first recipient, Dr. Carrie Schellenberg, who is now leading the ALS clinic in Saskatoon and has brought clinical trials there for the first time in a very long time. and is actually a co-chair of the CALS network right now. So showing this fellowship can really evolve future leaders in the CALS network. Dr. Amar Gavanini is currently seeing individuals with ALS in Mississauga, which is such a populous area. It helps people not having to go to Hamilton or Toronto, and can help direct them to those areas for more research opportunities. Dr. Marvin Chum is in McMaster, the second largest clinic in Canada by number of patients, and him with Dr. Turnbull, it makes for a really great succession plan there. He is a big part of the CALS network as well as a clinical research fellow. Dr. Amanda Fyander in Halifax is also in a private clinic, but has started to show a stronger connection with CALS and the potential to be able to be involved in some of the research activities possibly down the road. And then further to that, we have a number of young individuals who are starting into this, hopefully future leaders in CALS, again, hoping to bolster and increase better care and research across the country. And we're also very grateful to a partnership with Mitsubishi Tanabe Pharma Canada, who have been able to support 2 of these individuals, and hopefully more in the future, to really, again, build out the CALS network with future leaders. Now, back to 2008, one of the things that really sort of started the CALS network into bolstering it as a formalized network was a trial called the lithium trial. It was testing lithium carbonate. It comes from a clinical trial that was run in Italy, which said that lithium carbonate actually delayed progression of ALS in a clinical trial that they ran. And you can see here that when you look at the ALS FRSR, this was not necessarily a placebo-controlled trial. They just had people who didn't take lithium carbonate who were on riluzole and compared to them to the lithium carbonate. But there was a lot of chatter and individuals who wanted to be on lithium, and so it really drove the idea that this needed to be confirmed. And so ALS Canada and counterparts in the United States put in large amount of money for a collaborative clinical trial between NEALS and CALS to be able to do this at 14 sites across Canada, as well as many sites in the United States. And ultimately, it terminated early because they were able to show with what we call an interim analysis, so looking before the end of the trial as to how it's going, that it was not actually having any effect. But this really started the CALS network into something that could get future trials at multiple sites across Canada. Just as an aside here, I won't belabor this because we don't want to waste any extra time. If you are interested, lithium carbonate has actually made a comeback. Dr. Michael Van Ness in Utrecht in the Netherlands has found that a specific subtype of individuals who have a particular genetic mutation, something called UNC13A, when looking back at the data from the multiple lithium trials that were run, actually seemed to benefit from the treatment. And so they've actually put this forward into a clinical trial, which is really unique. And if you have questions about it, I'd love to talk about it another time, called the Prelude trial, but something to look into in terms of what we call a predictive biomarker, meaning that if somebody has this particular UNC13A mutation, it's predicted that they may actually benefit from the lithium carbonate treatment. So really a forward-thinking trial that's ongoing right now. So this is, I think, the home run when you look at all of the different clinical trials that have been run just in the past 14 years, and more to come through the CALS network. And this really demonstrates that they have done an amazing job at bringing clinical trials to this country. And you can see the number of CALS sites are quite large in a number of these trials. One of the ones that deserves a big credit, or a company, is Cytokinetics, because from a very early stage, they really have helped with the CALS network in terms of bolstering certain sites. You can see tirasemtiv here in 2014. They chose 12 sites across Canada and continued to choose multiple sites, and have actually been really great about taking young neurologists who are trying to get their first clinical trial in Ottawa, in Saskatoon, and really helping them to get that first industry-sponsored clinical trial. So big kudos to them in terms of helping to bolster the network as well. Now, again, I kind of try to bring this back to pop culture because it's not that long ago, and there has been a lot done. So we can see that in the next several years, there are a lot of things that can be done. If we think about the trajectory and the acceleration that things are on. So just since Iron Man came out, has this all happened? And something I also would love to talk about, which I said before, is that, modern ALS research is not 150 years old. It's really about as long as Daniel Craig was James Bond. So not that long ago, that we really started getting our eyes open into what's happening in the understanding of what's happening in ALS. And we can see that some of those things will hopefully come forward in the future clinical trials of the next several years. Just to sort of belabor this point really quickly in terms of Canada being a world leader in clinical ALS research, if you look at the number of currently or soon to be recruiting clinical studies, including clinical trials and observational clinical trials, Canada's third in the world as of earlier this month. That's pretty amazing. Yes, the United States has many more, but if we look at per capita, Canada really punches above its weight. The only three countries that have a higher amount of clinical research per capita comes down to ones where they're very small populations, but have some pretty incredible world leaders working within those countries to bring clinical trials to those sites. But again, showing that Canada, while we have work to do about getting it more national and to all the sites across the country, it really is punching above its weight. In terms of leadership of CALS, I also won't belabor this, but I just wanted to show it quickly. As I mentioned, Dr. Zinman was sort of the chair of CALS for many years. Eventually, it transitioned to Dr. Wendy Johnston, who we'll hear from very soon, and Dr. Colleen O'Connell. And then they decided to bring it to a group of three who were the executive leadership of the CALS chairs. So they invited in Dr. Aaron Eisenberg from Sunnybrook in Toronto. And at the same time, ALS Canada invested in currently our senior manager of research and CALS, is Colleen Doyle. And Colleen is playing an instrumental role in providing operational support to CALS to really make sure that it is moving as successfully as possible, because you can imagine the clinicians have limited time to be able to do a lot of the execution on things that need to be done to make sure these trials and other things are happening. After Dr. O'Connell rolled off, we had Dr. Geneviève Matt from University of Montreal joined the executive. Then the current chair now is Dr. Kristen Shoesmith from University of Western Ontario, from Western University, and Dr. Carrie Schellenberg has now joined, and these three individuals are now the current executive leadership of CALS. Now, CALS does a lot more than that. In fact, they have done a monumental effort in pulling together best practice recommendations for standards of care of ALS across the country. This is a webinar unto itself, so I won't go into that, but available in both French and English. Again, something that they're doing beyond the clinical trial aspect. And we really should highlight that there are a lot of other things that they're doing. So the clinicians are running special access programs. They have for both edaravone and for AMX35, now Albrioza. They provide a lot of input to try to get things moving on an ALS timeline once something is approved from Health Canada, through all of the different processes to try to get it actual access to their patients, and often engaging in many discussion panels, providing a lot of expertise, as we're going to see with Dr. Johnston in just a few minutes, and active participation in a lot of ALS Canada initiatives as well. And it should be noted that in the United States, you may see a lot of these clinicians and they've got a lot of profile, but they also tend to have a lot more protected time. And the nature of our healthcare system is that clinicians are really worked in a lot of different ways. And so to find this protected time is very difficult, and a lot of them do their work on volunteer time and are exhausted. And we're quite frankly very grateful for all the extra work that they do beyond what they need to do. And in fact, the other thing is many of them are working on not just ALS, but many other neuromuscular disorders. And if you look at the networks for some of the other neuromuscular disorders out there, you'll see many of the same clinicians are part of that work too. So really thankless and tireless work that they do in the CALS network to advance things for ALS. Constant juggling, and so we're very appreciative of that. So why are we here in the last minute or two? It's to really raise your hand, and we're asking you to raise your hand because when a company wants to run a clinical trial in a specific spot, they really come down to how can they get an effective answer as quickly as possible and ultimately as cheaply as possible to get that full answer so they can eventually get to a market for their drug. They want to get return on investment for their investors who are putting in the funds for clinical development. Now, how do things come to Canada? Well, you've seen that we have a great network here. So reputation is probably one of the biggest things that brings companies to Canada for clinical trials. We also have clinicians who have actively for many years gone out and seeked out really great trials and brought them back and talked about the Canadian system, like Dr. Zimin and Dr. Genge, who's done so much over the past several years. And at the same time, ALS Canada also plays a role in this, and we're frequently talking to companies early in stages of phase 1, phase 2, and building those relationships and highlighting all the different things that exist in Canada. I'm just showing you this very quickly. There is so much happening in Canada, and we like to make sure that we have these relationships built. If there's any company out there that you're kind of interested in what they're doing experimentally, there's a good chance that ALS Canada has built some form of relationship with them. And one of the big things that we want to do with that is not only to highlight the Canadian system, but also to introduce them to the leaders here in Canada so that they can actually connect with them about potentially having sites in their clinical trials. The other thing I'll add, this is just a sneak preview. I won't get into this too much, but the CALS clinicians, as well as a consortium of pharma who are invested in clinical development in Canada and ALS Canada, are collaboratively working on an earlier diagnosis strategy. Much more to come on that. But the idea there is, again, not only will that be so beneficial for people to get diagnosed earlier for themselves, but at the same time, getting them to clinics faster will also make Canada a better site for recruitment to clinical trials based on eligibility criteria. So at the end of the day, what are we asking? We are asking here in June Awareness Month that we want you to raise your hand and say that you are interested in continuing for Canada to be a future site for the best experimental research and the best experimental clinical trials to come here to Canadian sites. We have amazing clinicians. We have an amazing network. We are able to build those relationships and highlight what Canada has. But what we don't have yet is the ability to say that there is a huge appetite here to participate in clinical research. And we know that that's there. So what we'd love to be able to do is to provide that information to that industry when we speak with those companies. And just in the last slide here, I'll point out that this is a crazy slide that I was going to be presenting at our research forum, showing you how Canada's connected into the different clinical development, but there are hundreds of companies now that are invested in clinical research in ALS, and we are getting many more therapies coming to the clinical trial space that are based on better science and a better understanding of the disease, with a hopeful better chance at a stronger effect in those individuals who are being treated. So with that, that's all I really have, but I'm really excited to be able to get into the discussion now. So I'm just going to quickly introduce our two special guests, and then we're going to go off screen and go back into webcams. The first one is a professor at the University of Alberta. We've already talked about her, and a leader in the CALS network, as well as the director of the Edmonton ALS Clinic, Dr. Wendy Johnston. I think I might have, did I fail to say that she's a professor of neurology at the University of Alberta? And we also have former chair of the CALS network as well. And we also have Paula Trefiak. And Paula is living with ALS, has been a part of clinical trials. She'll explain that. But is also amazingly part of a ton of different committees and advisory roles, including our Scientific and Medical Advisory Council at ALS Canada. So we're so pleased. She's in Saskatchewan, and I'm going to now go off screen so that we can have a chat and answer some of the questions that we had. So let me just, there's Wendy. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen. So hopefully it has stopped sharing. And now we'll just wait for Paula to come on. Well, while Paula comes on, hi Paula. Thank you both for joining us. Wanted to quickly ask Wendy. So that was sort of an overview of clinical trials in Canada. You cannot really do it justice in a short period of time, especially the amount of work that you all actually do. was wondering what your thoughts are on sort of the evolution that you've seen in the CALS network and clinical trials for ALS in Canada over the past, many years.
So the difference that I note since I came back to Canada is the connectivity that we have with each other, which has been promoted by having the CALS network, and particularly the support that ALS Canada provided to having Colleen come in and be the glue that allows us to be bound together and to be a repository of knowledge, questions, and connecting us not only to each other, but to the possibility of clinical trials. So when I first came back to Canada, it was my reputation for as a trialist in the US that helped promote access by my being invited as an individual investigator to be a part of a clinical trial. Additionally, Mike Strong, who was very prominent in ALS work when I came back, also promoted that our clinic and I should be involved in, at that time, the Rilliazol Access Program, which did provide some financial support. The difference between then and now is that we have agreed as a group that if we're approached individually, and those of us that do many clinical trials are approached much more often than those who are newbies to the field, when any of us are approached about a potential involvement, we immediately contact Colleen, put the call out, contact the potential sponsor to say, hey, we've got many more people with good track records. Do you want to have more of us involved? And that has been successful in adding sites in areas where they are new, with the promise of mentorship and support from the established groups. So in this way, I grew. When I came to Edmonton, there'd been a fallow period where no clinical trials had taken place. And we're now at a point of we have 5 actively recruiting clinical trials, let alone all the ones that are not recruiting or being just in startup. So that the clinical trials landscape has become very active, and CALS has developed this connectivity at a time that allows us to respond to the number of sponsors, the pharmaceutical companies and investigator-initiated studies that wish to have eager and active recruiting sites. So I think the coordination of response to potential trials has been a significant improvement that I've seen over my time here.
That's great. Yeah, and I appreciate you really highlighting that, because something I didn't touch upon is how great everyone is about saying, well, have you heard of Carrie in Saskatoon? Have you heard of, and really that network of close relationships makes a big difference, I think. So thank you very much for highlighting that. And Paula, would you be able to tell us maybe a little bit about yourself and your experience with clinical trials? Or with
no
the
problem.
clinical trial that you have been a part of?
Yeah, so like I said, I'm Paula Trefiak. I'm from Regina, Saskatchewan. So Saskatchewan is a province with a very sparse population over quite a large landmass compared to other provinces. And at the time of my diagnosis, the province didn't have a neurologist who specialized in ALS after Dr. Hayter had retired. So I was actually sent out of province to the ALS clinic in Calgary for a diagnosis. And I was also informed of clinical trials that I could participate in there. And of course, if I wanted that care to participate in those clinical trials or have the multidisciplinary care, I would have to travel to Calgary for that. So I mean, this posed accessibility issues as well as affordability challenges. And when I say affordability, I'm not just talking about, the financial affordability. I mean, I had to consider the lifestyle I wanted as a mother of 3 young children between the ages of 3 and 8 years old at the time. Could I afford that the time away for travel, care, treatment, and of course the recovery as well that goes along with it. So in terms of trial participation, would it be worth it for me to even participate in anything, especially if, for trials, at the time, would it even be effective, right? So for me, I have a family history of ALS called SOD1, and approximately 90 to 95% of ALS cases are called sporadic or singleton. So what this means is that these sporadic cases are for people that don't have this family history of ALS. And of course, in approximately 5 to 10 cases, ALS is familial. So there is that family history, and due to a gene mutation that is inherited. And so this is what I have in my family, very known. So for me to participate in clinical trials, it was very, very important, because I wanted to be able to say at the end of the day, or at the end of my life, that I did everything I could for the next generation. So in November 2016, I was invited to participate in the phase 1B trial for the Biogen, what we call the Valor trial. The drug is now called tofersen, and I had to travel to Montreal to do that. So this was a double-blind trial, and of course there was the potential that I was only going to receive the placebo during this treatment. So I decided to participate in this. The trial wrapped up in May 2017, and then in March 2018, I was actually invited to participate in the open label extension, which meant I was actually getting the actual drug, and I accepted that as well. COVID and lockdown presented a lot of challenges to travel to Montreal, especially from Regina. I was having to take flights, say Regina to Vancouver to Montreal, or Regina to Toronto, waiting 11 hours, and then finally making it from Toronto to Montreal. And so I was very, very thankful that, both the Edmonton and the Calgary clinics stepped up, and they opened up their sites to offer this open label extension. And so I started participating in the open label extension in Calgary in May 2020. So that was great. And so these treatments, of course, require me to travel every 4 weeks to receive these treatments. They are received via lumbar puncture, which means I have to have an injection through my spine to receive them. And other than that, I'm very, very pleased with the results. I feel like it seems to be working. I'm still here years later, 6 years late after starting this, so that's good.
Thank you very much. Yeah, and I think that, your experience really highlights the importance of the network from both a positive and a negative standpoint, which is that we need to build up all the sites across Canada so that you can have access and not need to travel to Montreal. But at the same time, some of the momentum that's built in the evolution of CALS has allowed for that connection, so that Calgary and Edmonton could also become sites as well to allow you to have to travel less. So in terms of the fact that it's constantly on, and I think, Wendy, you could probably attest this, is constantly on the mind of the CALS members to try to elevate all boats across the country and try to think about how can we help another site to become clinical trial ready. And I know you've talked about that many times, about various sites. Okay, so one of the other things we had a lot of questions on was genetics. So pre-submitted questions, and I will say that what we can do is, for everyone who is registered for this webinar, there are some really great materials out there, webinars that have happened through the International Alliance and others that really bring this home in a very slow and methodical way to explain everything to someone, as well as explaining clinical trials that are currently sort of genetically targeted, like Paula had just mentioned. But maybe we could touch upon, in terms of clinical trials, some of the opportunities that exist out there from a genetic standpoint. Maybe Wendy, you could talk a little bit about where we're at and where we've come from, and where we're at in terms of genetically targeted clinical trials.
So first of all, when you're trying to target a genetically determined ALS, you have to know the genetics. So some years ago, the local genetics laboratory here in Edmonton agreed to set up first the SOD1 mutation analysis and then the C9orf. So we've been able to obtain these genetic determinations on individuals with a family history for many years. The big change came when there were clinical trials being offered. So previously, identifying the gene was more important for pre-symptomatic testing or for family awareness, for early diagnosis. But when therapies began to be directed at the genes, it became important to offer this to everyone. Although family history is an indicator that there may be a genetic abnormality, they're also sporadic. And I think, Paula, you alluded to that 90 to 95% of people with ALS don't have a family history, but they may still harbor, very rarely, one of the genetic abnormalities. So starting in 2019, I think it was, we started offering genetic testing to all patients with ALS, with the advice that the majority would not have one of the two major genes, SOD1 or C9orf. We've expanded this when a special access program for genetic testing became available, so that we could offer the potential to detect 40 other genes that have been associated with ALS. The other 40 genes, however, account for less than a third of genetically determined diseases, so that it is rare. Because there are gene-determined disorders, there is the potential to intervene early, and maybe in the future pre-symptomatically, before people start having symptoms. Right now, there's only one clinical trial that's currently enrolling for that scenario, for the pre-symptomatic scenario. Currently, there's, I think, 4 trials aimed at specific genes in Canada. And so when we detect the gene, or we find a patient who has the gene abnormality, I go to my list, trustee list, and contact the site that has the study to indicate that we have a potential participant. So our goal is to have people with ALS have access to clinical trials, and to have the one that is most appropriate to their own ALS diagnosis. There are clinical trials that are not just aimed at genetic diagnoses, but are paying special attention to people who have a genetic diagnosis. So there's at least 2 trials that I'm involved with where we're following patients who have any kind of ALS, but we're also doing specific evaluations and looking at the impact on people who have the C9 related ALS. So that the genetic makeup of individuals when they're diagnosed with ALS is potentially going to be influential on therapies they have. This is part of personalized medicine that you keep hearing about. The take-home message is that clinical trials are being aimed at specific genetic diagnoses. We advocate, certainly at our center, to have wide genetic testing so that people with ALS can know if there is any genetic correlation for their condition, and then they and their families are ready for the trial that will be aimed at their genetic determination.
And so, I mean, one of the other things that comes up a lot in the questions was around, someone who is not really aware where to start from the idea of whether or not they might want to look into having a genetic mutation in their family, or whether they're, if they don't have a defined family history, is it worth looking into this? Do either of you have anything you'd like to say on that, and around genetic counseling, or in terms of somebody who is considering whether or not they should get genetic testing, even if they don't have a family history?
Sure, I can often offer my opinion on that. So yeah, like I said, I do have the familial version, so I do have a family history, but I would still encourage anybody who is interested in getting that genetic testing done to, if you think that it's ALS, you might as well get it done. And like Wendy said, you might as well be prepared if something does come available, because I think the research is moving a lot faster now. There's a lot more promising treatments that are starting to come, and you're helping, worst case scenario, you're just helping out the next generation.
The provincial coverage for genetic testing is, of course, this is Canada, very varied province to province. There's also varied outlooks, and so that because between all the different clinicians, some of the doctors are still not convinced that it's beneficial to have the genetic makeup determined. They're worried about the impact on the individual or family of a genetic diagnosis. So they are on the more conservative end, and they might, for example, freely test people with a family history, but not be as comfortable testing someone who's had no family history of ALS or other neurodegenerative diseases like dementia. So there's a variety in approaches medically, and then there's a variety of supports based on the province. So we, as I said, we've been doing SOD1 and C9orf for many years here in Alberta. Because of this free genetic testing kit that's available, sponsored by, I don't know, one of the pharma companies. So Invitae is the genetic, but I don't know who's paying for it. So it's probably better that I don't know. Okay. But so we offer this, and it's something we offer. We don't do it routinely. It's discussed, but it is something. If you bring it up with your doctor, they can tell you the challenges that they may have locally to obtaining genetic testing. But I think if you're interested, that you should discuss it. I think physicians who are concerned about impact may not introduce the topic, but if you've already considered the impact and you feel that it's something you'd like to discuss further, I think you should bring it up with your neurologist.
Great. So there are a lot of questions. You know what, I'm going to highlight once again here that nobody's question will be left unanswered. We don't have time to get to them all today, but we'll make sure that we follow up with every person. So they're all recorded down. So we'll make sure that everybody gets an answer to their question. Something that did come up that's relevant to this, that is a question that just came in live, was around in the sales of Canada to a company. And Wendy, you'll be connected to this. One question was, with the evolution of the CNDR and its ability to collect real world evidence data, is this something that's an attractive feature that might lure companies to want to come to Canada because of, again, the networked aspect, that it's housed in many of the different clinics across Canada?
The CNDR is certainly a valuable asset that is available in many clinics, not just those that are currently involved in clinical trials. Where it is shown particular strength is monitoring for after approval or pre-approval, but not clinical trials setting. So the CNDR is currently not being used as a database for clinical trials themselves, in part because the companies, they're proprietary. They want to keep their own data close to them, whereas CNDR is operated independently, and it has contracts with pharma, but it is run by clinicians and scientists, so it's independent. So it's been useful to have this for monitoring post approval. It's been useful for many other studies in ALS. It's currently not being used as the base for pharma-sponsored studies. It was, however, used for a investigator-initiated study, and so that remains a possibility due to both the networking and the professional setup of its data collection, that another investigator-initiated study could be done through CNDR. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think you're explaining how it's an asset to Canada as well, and all of these various things that show that Canada is a valuable place on many levels to be able to do clinical development for a company. Okay, so we are actually quite low on time already, but I did want to touch upon, we had a number of questions as well around specific therapies or specific experimental therapies, and thought maybe we could touch on a couple of them. I think the hot button one at the moment is Albrioza, AMX35 in Canada. Wendy, do you want to mention anything to that? Would you like me to say something about that?
Well, I just want to say it is approved by Health Canada. We have had a special access program which has been supported by CNDR to monitor particularly potential side effects and the impact in a real world sense of this drug. So that has been already going on for some months. The tricky thing with a new drug is that it's approved, but it's actually not available yet. And so when it's commercially available, we still don't know the reimbursement, the rules around reimbursement, what the costs are. So it's exciting that it's approved, but it's a hurry up and wait, isn't it? Because it's approved, but people can't get their hands on it. I know we're getting a lot of questions from people, both in clinical trials and who are simply attending clinic, and we're trying to keep up on this. The company's doing its very best to keep us informed about how access will go. They're trying to make it as smooth as possible so that once each step is reached, we just have to plug people's names in and get them into the system to have access. For people who are currently involved in clinical trials, you'll need to discuss this with your coordinator and principal investigator. As you might imagine, the sponsors have been aware that this drug was on the horizon, and there's already provision in at least 2 of the clinical trials that I'm recruiting for people to be on the drug while in the investigational drug trial. So this is a very important topic of conversation that will need to take place between those participants in trials and their PI in the next weeks. The whole business of who should take it, what the side effect profile is, that's something that we'll have a lot of information on, but it's a little too much to go into on this webinar.
Yes, absolutely agreed. So if we were to switch maybe to one of the questions that we actually got a lot about was around stem cells, and in terms of clinical trials in Canada, we've never had any of the stem cell trials actually happen here. I think in particular people have asked about Neuron, and I know that that was something that the company was engaged with Canada about the trials early on, but it just was not a place that ended up being chosen to be run here. And as of right now, it's really in the hands of Brainstorm, I believe, and unless someone has anything other than that in terms of whether or not they want to run another trial or to apply to a regulatory agency with what they have. Anything to add to that? In terms of stem cells in general, I think there's nothing proven.
Well, that's the thing. And one of the things that's impressive about Brainstorm and Neuron is that the infrastructure required to create the product that's then injected is actually quite significant. And so there's only very small numbers of sites, even in the US, that were eligible. And the amount of startup funding required for that was simply overwhelming for a drug that has not really shown a lot of efficacy. Stem cells in general are, they're therapeutic for some conditions. If you look at malignancies like lymphomas and leukemias, they're the treatment for many people. But those are, if I can say it, dumb cells. When stem cells have to get smart to replace cells in ALS, that's where they've fallen down. They can't just move in and do the job of the motor neurons that are not working very well. And that's been the big barrier to stem cells working, is that you can give someone stem cells, but to get the stem cells to work within the nervous system is a step that has not been shown to be effective in any neurologic disease.
Yeah, and you make a good point that the choice to run their trial, the Neuron trial in the United States at the 6 sites that they ran it at was a pragmatic choice on their part, I think, in terms of the ability to they couldn't do this at 50 sites across the world just because of the nature of the actual treatment. So it wasn't a lack of Canada trying to look into it. It wasn't a lack of the company not wanting to come to Canada. In fact, they allowed some Canadians to be a part of it. It just, it's the nature of some of the trials that are more invasive overall. So there is we're all gonna go an extra 5 minutes here, but I think we'll have to cut it after that. I'll make sure we follow up with everyone. Paula, there were a couple questions to sort of highlight again on exactly which trial you were on, and then maybe I don't know if you feel comfortable talking about what the current state of that is. I know very recently there's been some new data that came out from that trial, which is interesting.
Yeah, so I'm on the Biogen Valor trial for a drug that has now been called tofersen, T-O-F-E-R-S-E-N. There we go. And so, yeah, this is a drug specific for individuals with the SOD1 variation of ALS, so that is the familial form. And so what this drug actually does is it targets your RNA, and basically it takes that damaged RNA and it kind of like unfolds it so it stops producing the proteins that are causing that destruction. And so hopefully, and based on the information that has been released, it seems to be significantly slowing down the progression of the disease. And so, yeah, for me personally, when I started the drug, I did notice some reversal in symptoms. I mean, not complete. And I think I am holding on to those gains 3 years later. So that's the good news about that. Now, I know there has been some controversy in a report that was released in the fall that said, the drug didn't meet its primary targets. And so that primary targets was based on the ALS-FR scale. And basically, that's that scale that you always answer, compared to before diagnosis, how well do you swallow? It's those questions there. So it didn't meet its primary targets there. However, when you looked at the biomarkers, it was meeting its targets. And so the open label extension that I am now on, when we looked at those results, it did seem to slow down the progression of the disease significantly. And so Biogen also has something called what we call the ATLAS trial. And so it's recruited people who are pre-symptomatic, and it's following them until they're symptomatic, and when they seem to be symptomatic, they're now getting that drug. And so I think Dave presented a slide that said that study will be completed in 2027. So we are really excited about those results to see what those will show.
Yeah, that one takes a long time because it's actually getting a biomarker spike that they can read in the blood early before actually the symptom onset in individuals, and then trying to measure whether it delays the actual onset of those clinical symptoms. And that's why I think the timeline seems so long away. But what a revolutionary treatment that is, or at least trial that is, to see if you could potentially delay onset for some people with SOD1 mutations. And that was a question whether tofersen works for any other gene than SOD1. It is targeting directly SOD1, so there's no evidence at all that it would work for anything else, nor really a scientific backing that it would be used for something else, unfortunately. But hopefully it's the start of more things to come like it as we get a better understanding of the science behind the rest of the cases of ALS. So noting the time, I'm going to actually give one of the last words to Wendy. Oh, you're going to actually, you can say what you wanted to say, and then I'm going to ask you one thing about cows.
Okay, so one of the questions that was sent in was, can I bring my spouse to a research meeting? And I really want to say strong yes. We want the significant other. We want someone who is someone who is a caregiver, is what's called in the trade. It's really important. In fact, some people early on in ALS don't feel like they have a caregiver because they take care of themselves. But I think having a significant other involved is a real goal, and many of the studies will in fact assist the transportation for people who need to bring a partner so that they can attend without a lot of cost. So definitely bring your spouse or partner.
Thank you for putting that in there. I think that's probably very comforting for a number of people who weren't actually the ones who asked that question.
If I can add something, I was just going to say, yeah, I bring either my spouse, and actually now that my children are old enough, they actually accompany me. They actually find it very comforting to join me, to know exactly what happens, and of course to be there with me afterwards.
Great. I think that's a really great one to add, so thank you. Again, I know how frustrating it is to ask questions. I'm shocked we have so many, but we will get to every one of them. I promise you, we're seeing your questions and we will answer them. But just to wrap it up here, given the idea of raising your hand to support, this is a great place for clinical research. One of the things that's very different between Canada and the US is the US, it's very visible what's happening in clinical trials. There's a lot of webinars. There's a lot of celebrity clinicians in a way that come from the US because, this is just, it's part of how it is. And I think there can be an easy sentiment that nothing's happening in Canada. And so what I kind of wanted to allude to here, Wendy, or Dr. Johnston, is in the background, there's a ton of stuff happening every day. And between the CALS clinicians and ALS Canada and industry, it is a constantly moving, constantly communicating beast that is working really hard for trials, for access to therapies, for information sharing and everything happening light years ahead of even where it was a few years ago, wouldn't you say?
Hmm. Yeah, and I think that there is the Canadian kind of the grass is always greener, combined with the Canadian not tooting our own horn. People with come in, they get diagnosed, they say, well, I'm going to go off there and ask them about what they're doing in research. And I said, you haven't asked me. Why don't you talk to me? I can tell you, you can go to the Mayo, you can go where you want, but a lot of times they're going to say, these clinical trials that we're doing, they're doing in Canada. And if you think about the importance of starting and completing a clinical trial, I tell people, don't try and guess the science. Nobody really knows which is the horse to bet on. Bet on the one that you can complete the race with. So think about, you want to volunteer for research, where can I do it that fits with my life goals? And Paula alluded to that, that you don't want to spend all your life time just going to a clinical trial in some remote place because you think that's the best one. It should fit with your life. There's research going on within your city, within a short drive, within a short plane ride on this side of the border. So really think carefully about where you want to invest the time, this time of your life, in both taking care of yourself but contributing to current and future knowledge.
I think that's great. That's a fantastic way to wrap it up. And just of note, please do reach out to your local clinician or to ALS Canada if you have questions about anything, because inevitably there's probably much more happening than you think in the background. It's just that I think we've largely prioritized action over promotion. And that's not a way to say anything about what's happening down south at all or elsewhere. It's just a resource thing, and we're prioritizing action, so, and impact. So thank you both very much for your time on this. We're 10 minutes over. We told people we'd do this till 1, so I don't want to take up any more of anyone's time, but just a note again that we will follow up with everyone, and thank you both. This has been tremendous, and hopefully everyone out there will raise their hand to show that they want this to continue to be a great country as a site for the best and most exciting clinical trials in the future and starting now. So wishing you both a wonderful rest of the day, wishing everyone out there a wonderful rest of the day, ALS M&D Global Awareness Day, and please do connect with us. And that's it. So thanks so much. And I think we can end the webinar. We'll be in touch, and reach out to us, please. research@als.ca. Take care.